The slot machine displayed a winning combination of 3 sevens. A cry of joy immediately erupted from the victor. 57-year-old Kwok Pil-hep, convicted of first-degree murder, hit the jackpot immediately after his release from prison. 3 hours after winning a fortune, Kwok Pil-hep stood on the roof of one of the high-rise buildings and was in a terrible state of complete decay. He smoked a cigarette and cried loudly and cursed himself for being penniless. He didn't know where to turn from despair and was ready to jump down from the roof, but a man stood up and spoke to him. The man noted that Kwok Pil-hep should have stopped after the big win, and then everything would have been fine. Kwok Pil-hep turned toward the voice and saw a young man in a business suit with a smile on his face. The man was walking slowly toward him, asking if he was thinking about what he'd just said. Kwok Pil-hep glanced at the guy and was convinced that they were not acquainted, although he knew his name. The young man came even closer and said that Kwok Pil-hep apparently could not ask his famous daughter for money because of a court order, and he was also afraid to kill himself because of debts. The guy smiled even wider and handed Kwok Pil-hep a small wallet and declared that for this very reason he would give him enough money so that he could start all over again. The young man opened his wallet and large bills began to pour out endlessly. The guy looked at his wristwatch and noted that withdrawing 1,000,001 every second was quite good, and then asked if Kwok Pil-hep had noticed that he had been doing this non-stop for 3 hours. Kwok Pil-hep was overjoyed and literally danced on a mountain of money, not paying much attention to what the stranger was telling him. The young man continued speaking and explained that with each withdrawal of money, something related to Kwok Pil-hep would gradually disappear. He looked at Kwok Pil-hep, who no longer saw anything around him except money, and asked if he was ready for such consequences, but he no longer heard it. Kwok Pil-hep thought that he had earned more than 10 billion won in just 3 hours. Kwok Pil-hep thought that with that kind of money he could play in a VIP casino, but he had little interest in anything else. Kwok Pil-hep believed that this was the only and true way to change his life for the better. The young man looked at him with some regret, realizing that the money he had given this man would only bring more trouble. Kwok Pil-hep jumped on the money and continued shaking the magic wallet, thinking about how his account was being replenished by 1,000,000 won every second. Kwok Pil-hep was delirious with the thought that he was destined to become rich at that very moment. At one point, Kwok Pil-hep froze with his eyes wide open as if he was afraid of something. He collapsed on the floor and began to cough violently, choking and floundering in the securities. The young man took a couple of steps towards him and asked worriedly if Kwok Pil-hep was okay. Kwok Pil-hep's gaze froze. The man no longer coughed, but he also showed no reaction to the stranger's words. In an instant, Kwok Pil-hep's life was cut short. The young man glanced at him and noted that apparently all was not well. Turning around and walking towards the exit from the roof, the young man asked one last question about why Kwok Pil-hep had been withdrawing money non-stop until he had exhausted himself. The young man smiled slightly and said that if Kwok Pil-hep had looked in the mirror at least once, he would have seen that along with the money his weight was also leaving his wallet. That was the price of wealth, but Kwok Pil-hep's greed and avarice proved his undoing. Blinded by numbers, he ignored everyone and killed himself despite being warned. The young man picked up the magic wallet from the floor and wondered who he should give it to next. The young man was curious about how all this would turn out for whoever got involved in the game. Jong Jimbo, who led the mourning ceremony at his parents' funeral, asked his sister not to worry, although tears welled up in his own eyes. Looking at his sister Jung-eun-hwa, who was 17 years old, Jong Jimbo, who was only 9, promised that he would enter the best university and provide her with a luxurious life. The boy noted that if you put their names together you get Jimbo-hwa, which meant gold, silver, and precious, and also meant that their parents wanted them to be special. Jong Jimbo promised his sister that he would definitely succeed and provide for her no matter what. After these words, Jung-eun-hwa extended both her hands towards him, wanting to embrace her brother. Hugging her younger brother tightly, Eun-hwa thanked him and noted that she should have said those words. The girl called her brother gentle and caring and thought about what a wonderful boy he would grow up to be. But by the time he was 17, Jong Jimbo had become the school's laser, and despite his older sister's hopes, he underwent a brutal reverse transformation. One of Jong Jimbo's classmates gave him terrible makeup and alone put 2 balls in a sheet instead of breasts and made jokes, while another classmate tried to film it on his phone camera. His classmates bullied him in every way possible, and this time they forced him to pose for the camera so that they could then send these photos over the internet. Jong Jimbo hated them, considering them perverts who enjoyed tormenting others. He couldn't understand how they could even dare touch him, yet he couldn't fight them back. In the midst of this fun, a girl entered the classroom and immediately began to swear at the boys who were once again making fun of Jimbo. The girl indignantly noted that now she understood why the guys needed her cosmetic bag and began to swear even more and say that they were apparently perverts and asked them to stop bullying others. The girl tried to take her makeup bag, but the guys started making fun of her too, holding her makeup bag high and calling her a 1.5 size because of her short stature. The girl's name was Shin Ae-chan, and Jimbo was delighted that she had come to his rescue again. He considered her not only very beautiful but also kind, something she had proven time and again through her actions. And the girl was swearing until one of the guys walked up to her laughing and put his hand on her head, which made the girl shut up out of embarrassment. The guy's name was Yang Ae-jun, and he smiled at Ae-chan and ruffled her hair slightly, placing the cosmetic bag right into her hands. Jimbo grimaced with anger. He didn't like anyone touching Ae-chan, especially his bullies. He knew he couldn't do anything, but he promised himself that the time would come when he would prove his worth to everyone. Jimbo glanced at Yang A-jun, who was always coming up with all sorts of bullying tactics. Jin Il-suk was his friend who always supported the bullying and filmed everything on camera. Jimbo thought they were pathetic losers and hoped that one day they would toil in the uniforms of couriers and workers. Jimbo imagined himself strolling around campus under the blossoming cherry trees arm in arm with Shin Ae. Jimbo believed that Shin Ae had the kind of looks that any relative would like, and he was sure that his sister would also immediately take a liking to her. Jimbo was incredibly in love with Shin Ae and imagined many times that his love would be reciprocated. Although he did not make any moves to win the heart of this girl, the hope that they would one day be together always warmed his soul until he saw one photograph. Shin Ae posted a photo of herself and her boyfriend on vacation in Bali online and added a romantic caption to it. Seeing this photo, Jimbo was very surprised that his beloved Shin Ae went abroad with her boyfriend. Jimbo guessed that Shin Ae had a boyfriend, but he refused to believe it for a long time. While smoking a cigarette, Jimbo, who was 25 years old and an ordinary worker with 0 love confessions and 1 rejection, thought about how much he loved Shin Ae. At that very moment, Jimbo's phone vibrated, alerting him to a new message. Jimbo received a message from his sister, and he immediately opened their shared chat. His sister asked if Jimbo wanted to have some delicious chicken for dinner, and after reading this message, the guy became thoughtful. They chatted for a bit. His sister told him she'd been promoted to assistant manager. Jimbo was engrossed in their conversation and didn't notice someone had sat next to him. Jimbo felt a sharp, powerful blow to the head. Someone had decided to make fun of him again and slapped him on the back of the head, causing him to spill coffee. Looking up, he saw a man who called him a fatso and, informing him that the break was long over, ordered him to return to work. Jimbo, watching the man leave, thought that maybe it wasn't scary that he was alone because his sister had recently received a promotion, and if he worked harder, he could probably earn more too. Jimbo, having decided to return to work, thought that someday he too would be able to date, travel abroad, and live like everyone else. He smiled at the thought that while he was healthy, he should have believed that his time in the sun would someday come. A couple of days later, Jimbo had to deal with devastating news. His sister had been diagnosed with blood cancer. Shocked by this news, Jimbo asked the doctor what he meant. The doctor looked at him and repeated that his sister had leukemia. The doctor explained that they wouldn't know the exact diagnosis until the test results came in, but the patient needed to be hospitalized immediately. Jimbo couldn't believe his ears. He thought he'd just come to pick up his sister after she fainted from the heat, and couldn't understand where this leukemia had come from. He felt as if the whole world was deliberately mocking him. He felt that all this mockery had already crossed the line. He remembered how his sister bragged to him that she had received a promotion and was so happy about it. Jimbo didn't want to believe that his sister was really sick and that life had been too cruel to the two of them. Thinking the world was very unfair, Jimbo went to check on his sister in her room. When he entered, she was watching TV and seemed quite calm. Looking at her sister, who heard someone enter her room and turned around, Jimbo thought that no matter how hard someone gritted their teeth and held on, there were still people who were destined to lose. He thought that hope for the best and dreams of someday were the privileges of those who were lucky from the very beginning, and even his sister's smile could not encourage him. After listening to her sister worry about the hospital bills, which would probably be huge, Jimbo thought that the two of them were born without the slightest bit of luck, and it would be better if they just lived the way they wanted. They clung on with all their might. The sister apologized to Jimbo, but this made him very angry, and he shouted at the whole ward, expressing his indignation. Jimbo began to cry, realizing that if he had only known that his sister would be dying, he would have given her all the money so that she could live the way she dreamed of. After talking with his sister and spending some time with her, Jimbo went home on the subway when it was already dark. He opened social media to distract himself. Checking his notifications, he discovered he still had no followings, and the conductor kicking him in the leg only added to the tragedy. Jimbo cringed and began to apologize to the conductor, who in general did not understand what he wanted from him. After this little incident, Jimbo opened a search and saw many nicknames of his former classmates. There were profiles in the search that he came across while browsing through pages, but he did not dare to follow them and simply searched to at least get a glimpse of their lives. One of his classmates failed his exams but still went to study abroad thanks to his parents and was now posting photos with a gorgeous girl. One of Jimbo's classmates passed the state exam but had not yet started working and had already gone on a trip to Europe and was now posting photos of herself with the Eiffel Tower in the background. Another classmate inherited his parents' business, becoming boss in his early 20s and always posting photos of imported cars online. Someone had already gotten married, and after the wedding their parents gave the newlyweds a house. Now this profile was constantly updated with new photos of the happy family. Some had trips abroad, vacations, and luxury brands. There were always luxurious photos that could never be replicated by Jimbo and his sister, or so he thought. Stopping at his classmate's profile and opening a photo, Jimbo thought that her beauty and everyday life were like from another reality, and that she lived in a world where he himself would never be able to enter. Jimbo carefully examined the photo, the landscape, and the girl's figure, realizing how disgusting he looked. One of the passengers sitting next to me grimaced when she saw a huge pimply guy looking at beauties online and chuckled in displeasure. Jimbo opened social media hoping to escape his sadness a little, but everything he saw only served to further remind him of how hard his life had been. All the photographs he saw were beautiful and showed the happy lives of other people. Some people fell in love, some traveled, some started a family, and for Jimbo it was unbearably painful to see. He felt worthless compared to his classmates who were good-looking and already owned businesses. Jimbo was deeply convinced that he and his sister would never experience such a life. It was very painful to understand this, and Jimbo just wanted to cry out loud from these thoughts. Unable to bear it, Jimbo put his head on his knees and, covering himself with his hands, quietly cried right there in the subway car. When Jimbo reached the area where he lived, it was already deep night, and he hurried home through the empty and quiet streets. All the way he thought about the problems that had befallen him, and most of all he thought about his sister's illness, especially the fact that blood cancer was considered a disease with incredibly expensive treatment. Jimbo sat on the floor leaning against the wall, thinking about how the bone marrow transplant alone would cost him tens of millions of won, and he and his sister had spent almost their entire salary on their parents' debts, so they had no savings. Jimbo also understood that his sister would be in the hospital and would not be able to earn money, and all the bills for treatment, housing, and food would fall on him alone. At that moment, Jimbo felt like he had only one option left. He no longer wanted to live because he simply no longer understood how to cope with problems. In the event of his death, he knew that his sister would receive the money since she had taken out an insurance policy for him that had been valid for more than 2 years, although she should have taken out the insurance herself. He drank, saying that he knew perfectly well that his sister would decide not to get treatment so as not to waste money, and therefore he should have died instead of her so that she could get treatment without thinking about money. Jimbo didn't notice someone's silhouette flash in the darkness, and when an unfamiliar voice asked if he had enough courage to commit suicide, he jumped in fear. Jimbo looked up and saw a young man in a business suit standing next to him. The young man smiled and noted that it was very stupid to die without even trying to change everything. In a very convincing voice, the young man noted that Jimbo had not managed to do so much right now, and thoughts of death were unacceptable. Jimbo asked the young man who he was, and instead of an answer, he only heard the question whether he needed money. When Jimbo rose to his feet, the young man explained that he only appeared next to those who were in desperate need of funds. The young man came closer to Jimbo and explained that from now on he would give him enough money so that he could change his life. Jimbo looked at the stranger with bewilderment. He didn't understand why he wanted to help him, and especially in such a big way. He didn't know what kind of person this was and why he was offering him money for free, and he was also surprised at how this person got into his house. Jimbo thought that he might have forgotten to close the front door, and the stranger entered his apartment, although at the same time I clearly remember how the lock clicked. The first thing Jimbo thought was that the stranger was some kind of psycho, although he looked too normal to be some kind of maniac and was even dressed in a chic suit. Jimbo looked carefully at the unexpected guest, and his image began to appear in his mind. The stranger had perfectly styled hair, clearly from a luxury salon, clean and smooth skin, and a suit that fit him as if it was tailored especially for him, and the guy also had a noble, confident expression on his face and posture. Jimbo even thought that the stranger was some son of a rich clan who amused himself by throwing money to the poor. Jimbo laughed and pointed his finger at the stranger, noting that he understood everything, and that he was probably filming a video for YouTube. Jimbo suggested that the man was pretending that poor people had no privacy or pride. Jimbo was sure that the stranger was simply collecting views on beggarly stories. The thought that this guy felt superior to everyone by handing out small change made Jimbo very angry and said that it was pathetic content. Jimbo asked if the stranger seriously thought he would be given the opportunity to lay out a family tragedy for a couple of bills, and clenching his fists asked how much they could offer him for breaking into someone else's home. Jimbo pounced on the young man and pushing him asked if he would give him $1 billion or maybe $10 billion. The man stepped aside and smiling replied that he could very well give Jimbo that kind of money. After which the man picked up Jimbo by the collar, leaned over to him, and asked if just $1 billion or 10 would be enough for him since he probably had wishes that he never fulfilled. The stranger smiled even wider and noted that with enough money Jimbo would be able to save his sick sister and finally do everything she had been putting off. Having backed down a little, the stranger also stated that all of this would of course only be on one condition and would depend on Jimbo's mood. Jimbo was taken aback and looked questioningly at the stranger, not understanding what he meant by his mood. Immediately Jimbo's mind flashed back to when he was still very young and promised his sister that he would become successful and provide her with a better life. He also remembered how he wanted to walk arm in arm with Shin Ae around the university campus. Jimbo also remembered how he believed that his time in the sun would one day come and everything would change for the better. Jimbo wondered what if everything he says and thinks could really become reality. Jimbo sighed heavily and lowering his head said that all this time he really had lived with the wrong way of thinking, and the stranger in response put his arm around both his shoulders. Jimbo realized that the foolish belief that he would one day be lucky and the endless illusion of happiness without foundation brought him to the place where he was and made him who he was, and he did not even notice it. Jimbo immediately amused himself and asked if the stranger wanted to say that if there was the right attitude, there was nothing that could not be achieved, and even having billions was entirely possible. Jimbo's smile immediately turned to tears and aggression towards the stranger for trying to shift all the blame onto him and not onto the unfair world. Jimbo burst into tears explaining that he had thought the same thing at first and believed that if he worked hard he would one day become rich. Throughout his life Jimbo became convinced that there were simply people around who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth and immediately became owners of houses in Gangnam and were simply billionaires from the cradle. It seemed that such people didn't even need to study because money decided everything, and there were always people who took exams for them or leaked their answers in advance. Jimbo believed that in extreme cases he could simply wash away his academic performance by simply going abroad to study and living happily there. Jimbo shouted that it didn't matter whether such people entered the university or not because at 20 they already had their own cars and their life was pure pleasure. Jong Jimbo was sure that as they grew up such people simply took positions in the companies opened by their parents and became managers. He was also convinced that when a person comes from a poor family, the only way for him to succeed was to be attractive. In this case, you could break into the stars or become a popular streamer, and if you didn't have talent, you could simply marry profitably. Jimbo cried loudly and shouted that in such a society his personal attitude and efforts meant nothing. Jimbo fell to his knees and sobbed, saying that everything was decided by simple luck at birth. The stranger smiled and asked Jimbo if he thought their meeting was a great stroke of luck in his life. The stranger leaned closer to Jimbo again. I looked him straight in the eyes and explained that all he needed was the determination to put his own life on the line. The stranger, his eyes flashing, said that Jimbo had something to hope for and that it was worth deciding on such an advance payment for his new future. Jimbo looked at him carefully and saw his terrible reflection in the stranger's bright golden eyes. Finding himself in a dead end with no chance of escape, Jimbo encountered something strange, but something that gave him great hope. He looked at the stranger who offered to change his life for no reason. Jimbo met the money god, and this was a chance to change his whole life beyond recognition. The stranger noted that Jimbo would receive so much money that he would be able to change his whole life and make all his dreams come true. This gave Jimbo great hope, and at that moment he believed the words of the money god, even though everything that was happening seemed like a dream to him. Jimbo immediately thought about what his life could become if he had money. The first thing Jimbo thought about, already fully believing that he would have money, was that he would be able to save his older sister. With money, Jimbo could do whatever his heart desired and would no longer be a loser who envied everyone around him. Still kneeling, Jimbo asked the stranger what his spending limit was. Jimbo doubted that the money god would give him an infinite fortune and asked about it directly and received praise from the money god for his insight. After clearing his throat, the money god confirmed that there were some limits and emphasizing that Jimbo didn't need all the money in the world to change the future, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. From the inside pocket of his jacket, the money block took out a small wallet and handed it to Jimbo, who looked at the thing with great surprise. The money god asked Jimbo to say hello and noted that the baby's name was Wallet. The stranger noted that Jimbo would be able to receive money thanks to the wallet. From the moment he accepted it, the limit would grow by millions of won every second. Jimbo looked at the money god with bewilderment and thought he was joking because increasing the limit by 1,000,000 won every second was a huge amount of money. The money god understood Jimbo's confusion and repeated what he had said, confirming his words. Jimbo couldn't believe what was happening to him at all, and hearing the amount of money that the stranger could give him was simply stunned. The money god explained that from the moment Jimbo became the owner of the wallet, it would bring him 1,000,000 won every second, and he opened the wallet and pulled out a bill. The money god waved a stack of bills in front of Jimbo's face, noting that in 10 seconds, he would have 10,000,000 won in his hands. The money god then took out another stack of bills from the small wallet, emphasizing that in a minute Jimbo would have 60,000,000 won in his hands. The money god asked what the wallet's limit would be when the day came, and the same time would come tomorrow, and began shaking the small wallet, and large banknotes began to pour out of it incessantly. Jimbo was completely stunned by what was happening. He sat on his knees on the floor, his mouth slightly open, watching the money fly out of the small wallet. He couldn't answer the money god, and then noted that apparently the guy was a bit slow with mathematics. Jimbo picked up one bill and checked if it was real. The money god assumed that such a limit should be more than satisfactory for him. The money god snapped his fingers and also emphasized that the main thing was that there was no need to pay taxes on this money, and Jimbo would not have to explain where the money came from for any expenses. The money box snapped its fingers again, noting that it was probably very difficult to believe. Continuing to shake the wallet, the money god said that he was powerless if after this Jimbo himself saw everything and did not believe. Jimbo began to come to the conclusion that everything he saw was real, and inquired about the conditions that the money god had mentioned earlier. The money god smiled and emphasized that in this world nothing was given for free. The money god closed the wallet and said that Jimbo could take money from it whenever he wanted, wherever he wanted, and as much as he wanted. I paused for a moment and looked at the guy again. The money block explained that for every amount Jimbo withdrew, something that belonged to him would begin to disappear. Jimbo, the task at hand, looked at the money god and asked what he could mean. The money man laughed and noted that if the guy wanted to find out, he should have withdrawn a couple of 100 billion from his wallet, but Jimbo immediately thought that this was very reckless. The money god suddenly showed 3 fingers in front of Jimbo's face and continued talking about the conditions. He said that there were 3 conditions under which access to money from the wallet was terminated. Firstly, if that very thing connected with Jimbo continues to diminish and eventually disappears completely, then it will not be possible to get any more money. Secondly, if Jimbo does not use the wallet at all within 30 days, the reason for its existence as a whole disappears. And thirdly, if Jimbo ceased to be the owner of the wallet by handing it over, abandoning it, or dying, then he would no longer see the money. Although in general, as Jimbo thought, this was more than obvious, because in the case of the loss of the wallet or the death of the owner, it would be impossible to take the money. The money block looked at the guy and with a slight smirk asked him if everything was simple with these conditions. The money god handed Jimbo his wallet and asked him to decide whether to accept the terms and take the gift or refuse it. The money god emphasized that once the wallet was in Jimbo's hands, he would have a chance to acquire untold wealth. Well, if Jimbo agrees and gains that same untold wealth, then in return he will lose that same something connected to himself as payment. The money god continued to look at Jimbo and asked him if he was curious to know if he could become truly happy by acquiring a large sum of money. Jimbo tried to swallow the lump that had formed in his throat from fear and could not make a decision. He thought that he had to either commit suicide so that his sister could receive the insurance payment, or live until he managed to spend everything and die, shortening his life day by day. One way or another, the outcome that awaited Jimbo was the same, which he was well aware of. He understood that refusing such a chance would be a very stupid decision. After thinking for a moment, Jimbo, with teeth clenched in fear, stretched out his hands to take the wallet from the money god. He understood that one way or another, he needed the money, at least to save the life of his older sister who had done so much for him. Jimbo looked into the eyes of the money god, which were somewhat similar to a cat's and seemed to glow in the dark. This moment was very exciting, and Jimbo, already clutching his wallet, was very worried about the consequences that could be very unexpected for him. To his surprise, taking the money god's wallet turned out to be not so easy, as if some force was preventing him from doing so. Well, the guy managed to take the wallet, and the money god immediately disappeared, and Jimbo himself fell to the floor. Jimbo looked around, but the money god was indeed no longer in the room, even though the front door was now open. Jimbo adjusted his glasses and looked around again to make sure he was still alone. After making sure that there was no one else near him, He looked at the small pink wallet which was called the wallet. Next to Jimbo lay stacks of bills, as if they had just been issued by the bank itself. Jimbo looked at the wallet and the wad of money lying on the floor and could not believe his own eyes that this was really happening to him. When Jimbo opened the wallet, he discovered that it was completely empty. But soon Jimbo discovered that as soon as he imagined the amount and put his hand inside the wallet, a wad of money would appear there. Immediately after this, he discovered that as soon as he thought about a different amount and turned the wallet over, money began to fall out of it. After counting it, Jimbo noted to himself that he had earned 60 million won in an instant, which was simply unthinkable. Jimbo was very curious to what extent this amount had shortened his life, and he was even afraid to guess anything about it. Although Jimbo admitted to himself that in truth the answer was obvious. That man appeared precisely when he decided to commit suicide. The money god simply exchanged his life, which he wanted to cut short, for money, and in other words, the more he spent, the shorter his life became. But in an instant Jimbo stopped caring about it, because in the end he realized that he was just a mortal living a fleeting life. On the other hand, he could now save his older sister's life and fulfill his dreams before he died. Just thinking about it, he noticed 2 dots on the wallet that looked like eyes. Jimbo took a closer look and thought that he had already managed to stain the wallet, since there were no stains before. But to Jimbo's surprise, the 2 spots on the purse suddenly narrowed. There was no longer any doubt that they were 2 small eyes. The next moment, the 2 little eyes opened again and stared at Jimbo. Jimbo never expected that the wallet would be some kind of living creature and immediately threw it aside with screams. The wallet fell to the floor and he closed his eyes tightly, as if he was scared, which was even more surprising. Jimbo, looking at how the wallet was shaking with fear and crying, stepped back, not understanding how this was even possible. The next day, Jimbo went to work even though he no longer needed to work. In the locker room, Jimbo sat down on a bench and opened his belt bag where he placed his magical living wallet. Jimbo poured water into a bottle cap and tried to give the little creature a drink. After several attempts, Jimbo concluded that the wallet didn't look thirsty. Jimbo was worried about whether he'd be okay, as he hadn't eaten or drunk anything the day before. He apologized, noting that it was very hard for him to be home alone. Jimbo suggested that the wallet go get some fresh air, at least for lunch. And he didn't notice how his boss appeared next to him and looked into his bag. The man asked Jimbo with an arrogant air if he was lonely, since he was talking to his bag. Jimbo didn't notice how someone approached him and, frightened, jumped up on the spot with screams. And the man said that he had completely lost his mind. Taking a drag on his cigarette, the man continued to complain that his worker had gone so far as to start talking to his wallet and having a full-fledged conversation with it. Jimbo objected and showed the wallet and asked if it looked like an ordinary one, to which his boss only chuckled in surprise. In his eyes, this wallet was the most ordinary woman's wallet, in which there was nothing surprising. Jimbo was surprised that the man hadn't seen the cute shining eyes of his wallet, to which Leisha said that he hadn't taught his worker a lesson enough and was messing around with nonsense. The man slapped Jimbo on the back of the head, saying that he should have been beaten until he came to his senses. Then the boss gave Jimbo another slap on the back of the head and scolded him for not being able to pull himself together and for constantly doing something incomprehensible. With a third slap on the back of the head, the boss said that if Jimbo had nothing to do, he should at least go get some cigarettes. At that moment, Jimbo remembered all the times his boss had beaten him, and in some cases he hadn't even noticed that he was eating lunch. Each time his boss's blows were unpredictable and completely unjustified. The man said Jimbo's face was just asking for a beating. Remembering all these beatings, something in Jimbo changed, turned upside down, and made him immediately think that it was not worth putting an end to this. The man swung again, but Jimbo deftly dodged the blow, which surprised his boss. Well, what was more unexpected for the boss was that Jimbo raised his hand in response. Jimbo was seething with anger and hit his boss in the face so hard that he lost his balance. Jimbo smiled, noting that he had been waiting for the opportunity to throw this. Jimbo took out some piece of paper with a pen and said what he carried in his pocket was just like that, until something appeared for its sake, and finally he waited for it. The boss received a strong blow and tried to get to his feet, holding his head and not even being able to swear from the pain. Jimbo threw the paper at his boss and said that if he thought it was unfair, he should sue, and he would file a counterclaim against the boss, which was carried out at the workplace. The man picked up the piece of paper and, opening it, saw that it was a resignation letter stating that Jimbo was resigning due to winning the lottery. Many couldn't believe that Jimbo could hit the jackpot, but from that very day he became officially unemployed. Jimbo had been wanting this for a long time, and after being fired he felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was happy that he became rich, and at the same time he didn't have to do anything except fulfill his dreams. The first thing he did was head to the hotel. Before entering the building, he stopped and looked up at the very top floors. It was the first time he'd set foot in a five-star hotel. It was a big deal for him. He walked into the hotel with a wide grin from ear to ear and immediately pulled out several large banknotes. Having fulfilled one of his dreams, Jimbo ordered a large set of different rolls and went to visit his sister in the hospital. Jong-eun was very surprised to see such a large and expensive set of rolls. She asked what it was, to which Jimbo explained that the doctors told him that she should eat well during chemotherapy and that it was important. He explained that he bought sushi because Eunhwa really loves it, and a lot of girls in the restaurant ordered this dish and everyone said that it was simply divine. Jimbo handed his sister the chopsticks and asked her to eat quickly while everything was still fresh. Eunhwa picked up the chopsticks and thought for a moment, noting that this dish was clearly a fight, and asked where her brother got so much money. She guessed that it cost at least 30,000 won, but Jimbo thought to himself that he hadn't even looked at the receipt and that it was now pennies for him. It was a sushi restaurant attached to a hotel, and everything there was 10 times more expensive. His sister had eaten only discounted sushi from the supermarket her whole life and had no idea how much anything cost. Eunhwa also remembered that her brother was supposed to be on shift and immediately became angry that he was skipping work. Then the girl noticed that Jimbo's glasses were broken and began to be indignant that he behaved so irresponsibly. She could not lie quietly in the hospital knowing that everything was not going as it should. Jimbo leaned towards her and told her that in fact everything was not as she thought, and told her that he won a big prize in the lottery. Eunhwa didn't believe him and thought he might be lying, but Jimbo, I'm reaching into my pocket, assured him that he was telling the truth. On his phone he showed proof that he was telling the truth and said that he took a day off and collected his winnings, after which he went to see her in the hospital. Eunhwa stared at her phone screen and fell silent. She couldn't believe her brother had been so lucky to win such a huge amount of money. The girl couldn't contain her emotions and screamed loudly from the emotions that overwhelmed her, which frightened some of the patients and nurses nearby. Eunhwa immediately had countless questions. She couldn't understand how her brother had managed to win the grand prize, and she couldn't believe he now had such a huge sum of money. Jimbo found a fake lottery app that promised to always be a winner, and thought he was lucky that his sister fell for it so easily. Jimbo, worried that his sister would find out, suggested that since things had turned out this way, they should first have a snack and pretend that it was a festive dinner that should be enjoyed. Instead of starting dinner, Eunhwa froze with her phone in her hands and burst into tears. She admitted she was very scared. She was afraid of her illness and even more so of the side effects from chemotherapy. She admitted she was afraid she would be the first to die and her brother would be left alone. The girl added that what scared her most were the medical bills and that she was worried that it was hindering Jimbo's future. She was afraid she'd have to withdraw all the savings she'd put aside for Jimbo to pay for her treatment. But now she felt relieved and cried with joy. Jimbo was very scared to see his sister crying and thought that she was simply unbearable, because even in such a situation she thought about him and not about herself. Jimbo opened a bottle of water and took several huge gulps, asking his sister not to cry and just eat. Eunhwa fell silent and thought for a moment before replying that she was still undergoing chemotherapy and therefore was not allowed to eat raw food, which put Jimbo in an awkward position. In the end, Eunhwa shared the food with her roommates, for which they were incredibly grateful and praised the sushi for a long time. Soon a nurse entered the room and addressed Jong-eun. The nurse asked if the girl had applied for a different room for the period and immediately stated that everything was ready and they could move. The private room was like a fully fledged residential apartment with all the amenities. At first glance, it was impossible to tell that this was actually a hospital ward. The ward was furnished in a very modern way, and there was an atmosphere of comfort. Eunhwa, upon entering this room, was shocked and even wondered where such a room came from in the hospital and began to doubt whether they had ended up in a hotel. Jimbo looked at his sister, smiled at her, and explained that from now on she would be receiving treatment in this place. Jimbo recalled that his sister had told him about her low white blood cell count, which meant she was susceptible to infections and would therefore now be using the VIP room to avoid contact with other people. Eunhwa replied in confusion that the previous ward had also been sterile, but Jimbo did not want to listen to her objection and said that he should go, and by glasses said goodbye and promised to come back later. Eunhwa followed his gaze and said nothing as she couldn't find the words. She was completely overwhelmed by what her brother had done for her. As agreed, Jimbo went to buy himself glasses since the old ones had cracked due to a blow from his former boss, and also to make other purchases. Entering one of the stores, Jimbo froze right at the threshold, not expecting to see one person there. The guy Jimbo met at the store immediately grinned and wondered out loud how it happened that Jimbo hadn't changed a bit since school. It was Jin Il-suk, Jimbo was upset that he had met the very person who had been bullying him for so long. Jimbo remembers that Jin Il-suk was once a fan of street food on skewers, and now he was a salesman in a Gucci boutique. This fact greatly upset Jimbo, who believed that even fate had to have at least some limit to its jokes. Jin Il-suk took the opportunity to laugh at his former classmate, insisting that he probably came to the mall to go to the restroom and even dared to show him the way. Jimbo firmly replied that he had not come for that reason and stated that he should have bought glasses and clothes and that he had booked a visit to the boutique. And then he showed the evidence on his phone screen. Il-suk laughed out loud. "I can't believe it." It's worth noting that the store had items that were way too expensive for Jimbo to afford. This didn't sit well with his colleague, who asked him to be polite with the customer. Il-suk hugged Jimbo, who didn't notice that he was going too far, and said that this guy was a henchman from his school, but the store employee still insisted that he shouldn't have communicated with customers like that. Il-suk laughed even louder and ruffled Jimbo's hair, saying that he didn't have a penny and that he was the most famous pauper in school. Jimbo immediately took out a wad of 50,000 won bills from her bag. Jimbo raised the pack over his head and said loudly that he had money and he just came to do some shopping. Jin Il-suk froze when he saw the wad of money, greatly surprised by such a statement from someone he considered a complete loser. Il-suk smiled widely and immediately changed his behavior and began to help Jimbo choose things. Soon Il-suk chose an image for his former classmate and began to praise his appearance in every possible way, although it was clear that Jimbo felt quite uncomfortable. But while another of the salespeople decided to help and adjust the bottom of Jimbo's pants, Il-suk took out his phone to take a couple of photos and cursed that his colleague was ruining the photo, saying that Jimbo was dressed entirely in Gucci and boasting about his styling skills. Il-suk took several photos from different angles. Il-suk thought that if he posted these photos online, he would get a ton of likes and at the same time scam the loser Jimbo out of money and make some money. Jimbo looked in the mirror and after thinking for a bit, said that he would take everything that was offered to him, which made Il-suk incredibly happy. Il-suk patted his former classmate on the shoulder and asked him to think carefully, but at the same time he noted how generous he was. Il-suk invited Jimbo to sit on one of the sofas for visitors, but without even listening to him, he declared that he would not sit anywhere and wanted to quickly complete his purchases. But knowing the nuances of salespeople's work, Jimbo pointed his hand at his colleague Il-suk and declared that he would buy from that guy. Il-suk even asked about it again, to which Jimbo asked a counter-question about how the client was supposed to choose who to buy from. Jimbo smiled and said that from now on they would often come to the store and hope that Il-suk would not pretend to be friendly every time. Jimbo wants to finish off even more the one who has offended him for many years in a row, and also warned that he is going to buy only from his colleague. Having sorted things out and taken sufficient revenge on her former classmate, Jimbo turned to his colleague and asked him to take him to the women's department, and she also wanted to buy something for her sister. Il-suk decided to do something and sent this photo to his friend with the words that Jimbo had stopped by his store and apparently won the lottery since she had spent a lot of money. Yang Jun laughed and thought that Il-suk had brought the chubby Jong to his store on purpose and dressed him up as a clown and took a photo of him. Ae Shin, seeing that Yang Jun had picked up his phone again, was indignant, reminding him that it was their anniversary and they were supposed to spend time together over lunch. And Jun laughed and handed the phone to the girl and explained that Il-suk had sent him something crazy, and when Ae Shin looked at the screen, she froze in surprise. And Jun wanted to remind her of Jong Jimbo, who studied with them at school. The girl remembered him very well anyway. It was at that very moment that Jimbo appeared behind Jun and immediately spoke to both of them. Jimbo smiled and called them by name, noting how long they hadn't seen each other and how glad he was to see them. Jun was amazed by the appearance of his classmate, but was hardly happy to have him in the house, unlike his girlfriend Ae Shin, who immediately lit up with joy. And Jun smiled tensely, noting what a strange coincidence it was that they met, not knowing that it was not a coincidence at all. After Jimbo left the department store, he went into Bellstar to find a trendy restaurant. Just then he opened social media and saw that Ae Shin had posted a new entry and tagged the location she was in. Jimbo immediately decided that he should go to the very restaurant where she celebrated her anniversary with Jin. And Jin, seeing Jimbo with his own eyes, remembered his friend's message and realized that he was not joking at all when he told their classmates about winning the lottery. And Jun immediately believed me that his former classmate could really hit the jackpot, although he understood that the things he bought in Il-suk's store were not counterfeit, which means they were expensive. Ae Shin smiled at Jimbo and noted that he had changed a lot since their last meeting, to which he objected, noting that he himself did not think so. Jimbo looked at the table where his former classmates were sitting and saw a cake with anniversary congratulations. It was clear that the two were dating, and Jimbo congratulated them on this, although he himself was not very happy about it, because until now Ae Shin had been very attracted to him. After Jimbo finished his congratulations, he looked at Ajun and spoke to him. Jimbo leaned over him carefully and whispered that he had become a real tightwad since their last meeting and winked. Jimbo noted that the a la carte menu for the anniversary was not a very good choice, and he could at least order from this menu. Jimbo had studied the menu at this restaurant in advance and found out that the set included both steak and lobster. But if you only ordered the steak, they wouldn't give you the lobster. Ajun didn't like that tone at all and jumped up from the table with insults, but Jimbo didn't react to it in any way, but on the contrary, he also noticed that Ajun also ordered wine in glasses. They ordered it in a bottle. Jimbo smelled the wine and turned to Ajun again. I noted that there was no need to even try it. It was clear from the smell alone that the wine was very cheap. And Jun could hardly control himself and cursed Jimbo in his thoughts in every possible way, who suddenly began to allow himself such expressions. Unable to bear the tension, Jun started shouting that they hadn't seen each other for only a couple of years, but he was already acting tough and noted that he should have been reminded how he used to get beat up by others. And Jun grabbed Jimbo by the collar, but then in a completely calm tone suggested that he first let go of his hand before opening his mouth, emphasizing that he had a new jacket that it was advisable not to damage. Ae Shin intervened in this quarrel and began to yell at her lover, forcing him to stop what was happening, because she could not stand violence in any form. Jun had no choice but to let Jimbo go and force himself to calm down. Meanwhile, Jimbo, seeing the waiter, asked him to come over. Jimbo ordered a very good wine from the 2014 vintage, stating its full name precisely, pretending to be an expert on the subject. After ordering, Jimbo turned to Ae Shin, noting that she helped him when he was bullied at school, asked her to let him repay her debt in kind, and thanked her by handing her a bottle of good wine. Ae Shin began to deny it, assuring that everything was fine, and she didn't need gratitude, but Jimbo insisted that she accept this guilt. "We'll put it in a bottle on the table." Jimbo said that he didn't want to bother them anymore and waved his hand and walked away. Ae Shin took the bottle of wine and laughed cheerfully, noting that she and Ajin had just been saving their wine, and Jimbo's appearance with thanks coincided perfectly with their need. And Jean was beside himself with anger and could not rejoice at the fact that they would be able to drink good wine on their date on the day of their anniversary. He didn't let Jimbo leave, and when he was paying for the bottle of wine, he called him Chubby Jong. And Jean flew up to him and started pushing him aside, taking out his bank card and saying that he couldn't afford to buy wine on his own without someone helping him. And Jean handed the card to the waiter and asked him to add the wine to his bill. Jimbo stunned Ajin by naming the price of the wine at 3.5 million won per bottle, and asked if he was sure he wanted to buy it himself. Jimbo, taking money out of his wallet, noted that Ajin shouldn't have been such a hero, since it was clear from his appearance how much money he had in his wallet. It was revenge for an incident back in school, when Ajin took Jimbo's AirPods, saying that a poor man couldn't use such things. Jimbo asked him to give him the headphones since his sister had given them to him for his birthday, but Ajin mockingly advised him to live within his means and wear wired headphones that befitted his status. Jimbo reminded Ajin of this incident and advised him to be more modest with food and eat what he could afford, adding that he had bought wine for his girlfriend and that he would buy some for himself. Jimbo placed the money on the table and asked the waiter to accept it and pay off the wine bill, while Ajin was shaking with anger. After this incident at the restaurant, Jimbo thought that he himself should have lunch. He ate thinly sliced frozen pork and said that it tasted wonderful. Even after the hotel sushi and lobster steak, his stomach is still captivated by frozen pork. It has always been that way. Stroking his full belly, Jimbo thought with a smile that before he didn't save money on food, but now he can eat until he bursts. Jimbo remembered his magical living wallet and offered him a small piece, immediately apologizing for waking him up. But the wallet looked at its new owner with some sadness and again refused to eat, and at that moment Jimbo noticed some changes in the wallet's appearance. Jimbo noticed that there was some kind of bulge on the side of the wallet, and upon closer inspection he realized that it was a wing. The little wallet smiled and flapped its two wings. Jimbo was very surprised. He couldn't understand where those two wings came from. After thinking for a bit, one thought that could explain what was happening appeared in Jimbo's head. He suggested that perhaps the more money he took from the wallet, the faster the wallet evolved, and that was why it now had wings. The idea that the wallet actually evolved depending on the amount of money taken from it was quite logical. Jimbo thought that before, when he didn't spend a penny, his wallet was just an inanimate object. When Jimbo withdrew 5,000,001, two small eyes appeared on the wallet. At that moment Jimbo realized something and felt a certain fear, remembering all the stages of development of his magic wallet. Now he had wings and he was very cheerful, but how he would evolve further was completely incomprehensible. Jimbo wondered how much money he had pulled out of the wallet before it began to evolve, and after calculating he guessed that the amount was more than 253 won. These numbers upset Jimbo because he realized that he had become blinded by greed just like his mother once was. Jimbo also remembered the fee for using money and realized that with each passing day while his wallet grew his life was decreasing. These thoughts made Jimbo lose his appetite and he hung his head in disappointment, thinking that he was doing something very wrong. But very quickly these thoughts disappeared somewhere, and he thought that in general he shouldn't have cared because sooner or later he would face death anyway. And he had only one life and it was worth enjoying it to the fullest. He decided that he would eat his fill of cold samgyeopsal and not think about what would happen to him sooner or later anyway. He soon returned home and for some reason decided to step on the scale to see if he was gaining weight. But when he saw the number on the scale, he was very shocked. Jimbo's legs began to tremble with fear and began to give way beneath him. He couldn't understand how his body could be capable of such a thing. His weight had increased significantly and Jimbo couldn't understand how he could have gained so much weight in just one day. Even though he had been eating like a pig, this figure was too big. Upset, Jimbo got off the scales and went to get dressed, thinking that if this continued he might simply die from blood loss. He took the wallet in his hands and thoughtfully decided that now it was worth keeping his appetite under control because it was still too early for him to die. He understood that he still had a lot of things to do that needed to be completed, and for this he needed to take care of himself. On those nights when his shift arrived, this happened to him for the first time in his life. He lay there and took notes by lamplight, jotting down what else he wanted to buy or try. It was very quiet in Jimbo's apartment. The only sound was his own snoring. Before bed, he carefully folded his new clothes next to the wads of cash he'd managed to take out of his wallet. The fan ran all night because Jimbo had been feeling hot all the time lately and had trouble sleeping properly. In addition to Jimbo's snoring, the silence in the apartment was also broken by the punishing water from the tap in the kitchen. Overall, the situation was quite calm, but Jimbo woke up very suddenly and literally jumped out of bed. He was scared that he had overslept and swore that his alarm clock had not worked at all and was unable to wake him up. The first thing Jimbo did was pick up his phone to check the time, thinking that he was screwed and that he was late for everything. Jimbo's gaze fell on the wallet that lay nearby on a separate pillow and smiled sweetly at him. Seeing the wallet, Jimbo breathed a sigh of relief, remembering that he no longer had a job, and laughed that he was able to forget about it. Jimbo wished the wallet a good morning and jokingly asked it to take care of his wishes that day, to which the wallet smiled broadly and flapped its new wings. Jimbo had a completely ordinary day without school or work. For the first time in so many years, he felt completely free and happy. He hurled his resignation letter in the face of the boss he'd once feared deeply and quit without warning, as if it meant nothing. Now he could get himself together and pursue his dreams without worrying about anything. Previously, if he was late for the metro by even 10 minutes, he would get to work in a cold sweat, understanding what the consequences of being late would be for him. But now that he had money, no boss or company was scary to him anymore, and he could devote all his time to himself. Jimbo went shopping and bought himself new clothes, went to salons to get his hair cut by very good hairdressers, and with each passing hour his self-confidence grew. Now Jimbo understood why all the rich people were so confident in themselves and their future and little worried them. Jimbo admitted to himself that he used to feel like an outsider even in the Cheongdam area, and just walking down the street he would feel awkward and tense. Now it was as if he himself had become part of the people from this area and could calmly walk down the street of the city with his head held high because he felt equal to everyone and perhaps even superior. One day while walking down the street in this area, he saw a car stop at the side of the road and a girl in high heels got out of it. The girl had the looks of a model. She possessed incredible beauty, and a figure was wearing a chic dress and looked very confident. Jimbo immediately focused his attention on her, appreciated her beauty, and even thought that she was an idol. Jimbo chuckled to himself and thought that this was to be expected from the Cheongdam area where mostly rich people lived, and seeing an idol on these streets was something common. Jimbo became curious about where this girl was heading, and without really realizing it, he followed her. Jimbo stopped near the entrance to the building and looked at the signs of the shops and establishments that were located in this building. He also began to shake his head, trying to wake up and forcing himself to pull himself together, shouting to himself that he could lose his innocence and was going to waste his frequency in this way. Jimbo focused on his convictions and tried to push all impure thoughts aside. He reminded himself that before him there was nothing better than true and pure love, and he should not waste his energy on anything else. While he was thinking about this, a cute girl appeared right in front of him. She smiled and apologized for distracting him. Jimbo looked at her carefully and noted how beautiful she was and how sweet her smile was. Her beauty left Jimbo speechless, and he felt very awkward, not even having any idea what this beauty could want from him. The girl smiled at him again and complimented his appearance. Then she asked if he had a free minute. Jimbo was confused, but he thought that this was the very hunt that everyone was talking about. Money made his hairstyle and appearance, and money chose his style and fashion, and even his confidence was born from money, and now it's time to reap the benefits of it. Jimbo thought that since he now had money, beautiful girls themselves began to stick to him. Jimbo smiled back at the girl and assured her that he had plenty of time, which made her very happy. The girl winked at him and, taking out a camera for filming blocks from somewhere, asked how he felt about it. Jimbo was very confused and couldn't even give his answer right away because this was definitely not what he expected from the sweet stranger. The girl started taking pictures of him and said that at first glance it was clear that his image cost more than 10 million won, and then asked how much all these clothes cost him. The girl approached Jimbo and filmed the two of them. Jimbo replied that he didn't even look at the prices when he bought things, which impressed the girl, who remarked that it was a real show of wealth. Jimbo said that he had just bought these things and put them on straight from the store, and even saved the receipt, and immediately reached into his bag to show the receipt to the girl. The girl took the receipt and filmed them again, saying that the cash receipt from the store was 100% proof that everything was real and not a fake. The girl began to look through the receipt and asked to allow her to calculate the final cost of Jimbo's image. According to the blogger's girlfriend's calculations, the total cost of Jimbo's look was about 18 million won or even more. Soon Jimbo came across a video about himself on social media, and it turned out that it was a talent show, and he decided to watch the video to the end. While he was watching a video about himself, he received a notification about a message on a social network. "What kind of girl are you?" She wrote him a long message telling him about her serious family problems and asking him to lend her 50 million won. She promised to pay it back within a year and 80 million won as thanks. This girl's story deeply touched Jimbo. He'd heard that celebrities often received hundreds of messages asking for money, and now he was convinced it was true. The talented blogger asked him to give her his Instagram account, and without thinking he gave her his secret account, which was a mistake. And now he really had hundreds of messages from different people. After reading a few, he concluded that this sudden public attention was already beginning to tire him, and even considered simply deleting his account. While scrolling through the dialogues, he came across a message from a girl who asked how he was doing. Jimbo almost choked on his drink from shock when he saw that this girl had written to him herself. The girl's name was Ju-lin, and Jimbo couldn't even believe it was her at first. He'd seen her photos on social media many times and always admired her beauty. Jimbo was overjoyed, but he couldn't immediately believe that this had actually happened, and to him at that. Ju-lin was a true goddess at school, and everyone considered her a princess. She was always popular and had many friends. From her very first year of study, she was adored by the senior students, and her status was so high that absolutely everyone bowed their heads before her. In other words, thanks to her looks and figure alone, she was literally able to conquer the entire school without doing anything special to achieve it. Jimbo thought that they were of different breeds and had never even communicated in person, and therefore what she wrote to him was strange. Jimbo considered whether he should answer her. He was afraid it might be another taunt, or he was afraid of behaving inappropriately and pushing her away. So he finally decided to answer her. She asked him how he was doing and remarked that it had been a long time since she'd last heard from him, and Jimbo responded by saying they had indeed been together for a while. The message was read immediately, which surprised Jimbo even more. The girl wrote that Jimbo has not changed at all since then. Jimbo didn't take this as anything bad towards himself, but was impressed that the princess still remembered him. The girl then asked what Jimbo had been doing all this time, and he thought that this dialogue already smelled of something serious. During their school years, the two of them passed each other and paid absolutely no attention to each other. At least she did not pay any attention to him. Jimbo began to fantasize that they met by chance after graduation, and by the will of fate fell in love with each other and built a strong family. His thoughts about the strongest love were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Jimbo took the wallet off his head and placed it on the pillow, saying that the delivery courier had probably arrived. He opened the door slightly, thinking that he would quickly eat some noodles and continue chatting with Ju-lin, but behind the door was not a courier at all. Jimbo was confused and looked around the corridor just in case, trying to understand what was going on. Jimbo did not understand how this could happen and froze on the threshold. Meanwhile, the wallet lay calmly on the pillow where it had been placed and watched its owner. Jimbo saw Yang Ajun and Jin Il-suk at his doorstep looking friendly enough. But Jimbo was very surprised how they had gotten to his house and even found his address. Jin Il-suk, as soon as Jimbo opened the door, came into his apartment and asked him not to tell him that joining the store club was just to accumulate points. Jin Il-suk hugged Jimbo and led him into his own house, saying that they had a lot to discuss, and asked Ajin not to stand like a pillar on the threshold and to go into the house. Ajin slammed the front door shut as he entered Jimbo's apartment, and Jin was outraged that Jimbo's apartment was a mess and asked if he was planning to move, and Il-suk noted that the apartment smelled like a storage room. Jimbo considered these two to be vile bastards who dared to attack him right on his own territory, and thought that since they were together it meant they wanted to take revenge on him. There was no other option. Last day Jimbo humiliated and insulted them, and these guys are used to always being on top. Jimbo immediately realized what could happen in the near future and prepared himself for the worst. While the guys were looking around Jimbo's apartment and making some jokes about the furnishings, Jimbo remembered his wallet. He picked it up in his arms. I think he gives it to others. This wallet looked more like an ordinary thing, but it was worth playing it safe. Having picked up the wallet, Jimbo apologized to him that it might be unpleasant, and promising to take care of him, asked him to be patient for a little while. At that very moment, Jean called out to him, and Jimbo turned around trying to guess what they wanted from him. And Jean grinned and noted that he and Il-suk forgot to explain that they had something to talk about. Jimbo was all tense but ready for any conversation, believing that he was no longer the loser they knew. Now he didn't care what they could do because he had money and the guys would get what they deserved anyway. He expected them to attack and was ready to defend himself in every possible way. Jimbo was asked to sit on the sofa and he obeyed, but he still expected the worst. Both guys knelt before him and bowed their heads slightly, and it even seemed that they could begin to ask for forgiveness. And Jean raised his head and smiled broadly and asked Jimbo to calculate what kind of investment they would offer. They asked him to lend them 50 million each and promised that within a year they would return 120 million won to him, that is with interest. The guys noted that they weren't untalented, which Jimbo himself should have understood, and Il-suk explained that they had simply been deceived by some stock market scammer, and now they needed money. And Jean immediately snapped at him for talking about stock market scammers. I didn't understand what I said wrong. And Jean calmed down and explained that the more assistance Jimbo has, the more profit he will make. And so they came to give him a chance to earn more. Jimbo, thinking that money was power and made people fall on their faces, stood up from the sofa and looked down at the guys. The ladies said that since fate had brought them together again, they should not remember the past and start their relationship from scratch. And Jean noted with a smile that the world had always worked this way, and the rich gave their money to the poor. Jimbo was impressed by such a speech from those who had humiliated him his entire life. He felt growing irritation at what they dared to suggest to him. He remembered every moment when these two offended him and took away the last money that his sister gave him. He begged them with tears in his eyes not to take his money, but they never listened to him and threw an empty wallet in his face. They constantly robbed him and sometimes even managed to beat him up, and they also threatened to kill him if he suddenly stopped giving them money. They said that the poor should crawl on their knees behind those who stood above them, otherwise it would be because of them, and they asked Jimbo to remember this. Jimbo still remembers every phrase that Ajin and Il-suk said to him, and that's why their request seemed absurd. Jimbo was surprised that they were talking about how the rich should live and the poor, and noted that it seemed like the opposite, the poor should crawl on their knees before the rich. He looked at both boys and asked if he could just hit each of them once before deciding whether to give them money or not. The guys immediately started arguing, and Il-suk almost got into a fight first, but his friend stopped him. And Jean asked Il-suk to just play along, noting that Jimbo's punches were actually very weak, and even if he hit him, it wouldn't hurt. He asked his friend to think about the 50 million they could get in return for just one blow from some weakling. Il-suk finally made up his mind, but asked Jimbo not to hit him in the face since he had to go to work the next day. Il-suk asked if it was worth leaving the past in the past with just one blow, and Jimbo nodded approvingly, getting ready to strike. Jimbo clenched his fist tightly and swung it sharply. Jimbo had been waiting for this moment her whole life and was therefore fully prepared to give it her all. The blow was actually quite strong, and Il-suk lost his balance from the pain and flew back. Il-suk, convinced that he wouldn't feel the weakling's blow, was stunned by what actually happened. And Jin looked at his friend with disdain and thought that he knew perfectly well that he was pathetic, but he didn't think that everything would turn out to be so serious. And Jin, looking at his friend who seemed to have pretended to faint, thought that he looked pathetic and funny, and that betraying himself for 50 million was absurd. And Jin threw it into the bag and thought that he would not lose to his friend. He told Jimbo that his face would withstand it and he could go wherever he wanted. Jimbo didn't waste any time and immediately swung his sword and launched another punch, aiming straight at Ajin's face. Jimbo's fist landed right on Ajin's nose, and he immediately whined in pain. At that moment of impact, Ajun truly lost touch with reality. The blow from Jimbo was so powerful. Eunhwa spent the entire time in the hospital undergoing treatment. When I called and explained what was happening, she asked the person not to worry about her and to do as she pleased. Eunhwa said that her colleagues came to visit her and she wanted to chat with them a little. She told her colleagues that her brother had called her, and they concluded that they were probably very close. Her colleague noted that she was very worried when Eunhwa went on sick leave, but the knowledge that she had such a reliable brother calmed her down, which another colleague agreed with, emphasizing what kind of room the girl had. Colleagues noted that one way or another the girl must recover quickly for her brother's sake, so as not to waste her youth in the hospital. At that moment, colleagues remembered that Ms. Ji-hai had also been diagnosed with leukemia and had resigned last year. And then they began to say that perhaps the problem was environmental pollution or stress. Eunhwa immediately became sad upon hearing this, and became quiet while her colleagues continued talking about the possible causes of such a terrible disease. When Jimbo called his sister, he was outside. He was glad that his colleagues had come to see her and didn't detain her. He finished the conversation and sighed heavily, thinking that, even after talking with his sister, he could not calm down. He was worried that Princess Ju-lin herself invited him to the meeting that he was going to, which made him incredibly nervous. He thought that this body that is his body had never before encountered female substances personally. Unexpectedly for Jimbo, someone came up to him from behind and, placing a hand on his shoulder, drummed his fingers on it. When Jimbo turned around, someone's small gentle finger poked him in the chubby cheek. He saw Ju-lin, who greeted him with a smile, and noted that they had not seen each other for a long time. Jimbo jumped up on the spot, not expecting that the meeting with the princess would happen right at that moment. Jimbo was amazed that such a beautiful girl touched him herself and generally agreed to come to the meeting with him. Ju-lin, ignoring her friend's confused look, assumed that he probably hadn't eaten yet and suggested that they go get a snack first. When the girl chuckled, Jimbo realized that he had simply switched off for a second and did not answer. He immediately turned away from her and walked very quickly towards her, and she started talking about knowing a good restaurant very close by. But Ju-lin didn't let him run away so quickly and took him by the arm, asking him to wait a little and not rush. She explained that she had already reserved a table for the two of them and asked them to follow her. Jimbo was truly frightened because he didn't know how to act. For the first time in his life, a girl took his arm and acted so sweetly towards him. He couldn't even remember what their conversation had been about or how the walk to the restaurant had gone. His memories of the experience had vanished completely, but he remembered well the looks of people passing by who openly stared at him next to such a wonderful girl. The gazes of passers-by were literally riveted on the two of them, and it was impossible to erase it from memory. Jimbo also remembered how Princess Ju-lin's warm and soft hand wrapped around his sweaty and thick one. All his attention at that moment was only on his left elbow and on Ju-lin, who was standing next to him and smiling broadly at him. The girl booked a place in a restaurant where each table was like a private office hidden from the eyes of others. Even though the air conditioner was blowing at full blast and the room was even getting cool, Jimbo still felt uncomfortable. Sweat poured down his body in streams due to intense excitement and embarrassment, and this symptom was aggravated when Ju-lin came too close. At one point, the girl sat down next to him and asked if he was too hot when she saw beads of sweat on his face. Jimbo was upset yesterday because the girl generally sat next to him, but she also decided to help him a little and wiped the sweat from his face with her hand. Seeing Jimbo's worried look, the girl herself became worried and asked if everything was okay with him. Jimbo only thought about how close Princess Ju-lin was to him, so close that his heart skipped a beat. Jimbo looked into Ju-lin's eyes and nothing could make him look away. He seemed mesmerized. Jimbo felt her touch and fell further and further from reality, not even finding the strength to move in the village. The girl began to move closer and closer to Jimbo, and it looked like she wanted to kiss him. Jimbo shrank even more and thought only about how she was getting closer and closer to him. It seemed to him that he was going crazy. Well, what if he noticed something on the girl's hand that he didn't like at all? He abruptly grabbed the girl by the hand and pushed her away from himself a little. He carefully examined the girl's hand and noticed that one area was covered with a large large bandage. He looked at Ju-lin with a serious gaze and asked directly if someone was beating her. The girl immediately moved back and smiling tensely asked why he suddenly asked her such a question. Jimbo explained that he was embarrassed by the bandage on her arm and suggested that it might have been to cover a bruise. Jimbo noted that the large patch was most likely a cooling compress and the small one was probably a warming patch. Jimbo emphasized that if the girl used both a cold and a warm bandage on the same hand, it meant that she had a bruise in different stages of healing. Jimbo was no longer so confused and asked who was raising a hand to the girl and said that she could ask him for help if she needed it. Ju-lin covered her face with her hands and struggled to hold back her loud laughter, which left Jimbo a little confused. Ju-lin straightened up, smiled, and asked what Jimbo meant by that. I claimed that no one would dare raise a hand against her. She explained that these were marks from pole dancing, and that the constant friction from the A6 caused these bruises to appear. The girl rose from her chair and throwing herself out noted that Jimbo should not have thought that a body like hers was achieved without effort. Jimbo felt better when the girl explained why she had bandages on her arm. He liked the story about her simply pole dancing. Moreover, when he found out that she was engaged in such dances, he considered that she was the best of the best. Ju-lin sat down at the table again, but a little further away, and noting that she was already dying of hunger, she offered to order food, and then asked what Jimbo would like to eat. After discussing what they wanted, they ordered food worth 230,000 won per person. The dishes were the size of a pea, but each of them looked like a work of art. With each new dish, the waiters completely changed the table setting, and Jimbo thought that the restaurant must have been piling up a mountain of dishes by the end of the meal. Now Jimbo understood what people called haute cuisine and suddenly remembered the bibimbap they had eaten a couple of days ago. Once a week she and her sister ate bibimbap. It had already become a tradition for them. The sister took all the leftovers and raked them into one bowl, and then they simply ate from the old spoons. It was hard for them financially to throw away the leftovers and also very sad, so they ate it all, calling it bibimbap. Until that day, Jimbo always thought that food was just a way to fill his stomach and not feel hungry. But then I realized that the rich always received true pleasure from this process and thus did not just satisfy their hunger. Ju-lin noticed that Jimbo still looked uncomfortable and even froze for a moment. She looked at him carefully and asked if everything was okay. When Jimbo replied that he simply ate very well and was focused on his food, the girl put the dessert spoon aside a little and, resting her head on her hand, asked if he had really decided to talk to her. The girl noted that he'd exchanged a word with me earlier, and she was already thinking he'd soon start talking to the wall. Hearing this, Jimbo felt even more awkward. Jimbo thought about how everyone said that rich people were good-natured and did not hold grudges and were not vengeful, but on the contrary kind and sympathetic. Ju-lin was a shining example of these words. She glowed with kindness and didn't give even a hint of any bad qualities. Jimbo admired her completely. She truly was a very kind, sweet, and sympathetic girl who never said anything negative. In Jimbo's memory, Ju-lin had always been on his side and had never done anything bad to him. Now, when they met after so many years, the girl surprised him even more when she almost kissed him. Jimbo was fixated on this moment and could not get it out of his head, continuing to replay what happened over and over again in his head. Still unable to resist, he smiled and very carefully asked if Ju-lin wanted to tell him something when she wiped his sweat, but at that very moment his phone rang. He jumped up on the spot, shouting that he had forgotten about everything, and immediately answered the call. When he answered the call, a real estate agent greeted him to remind him that there was half an hour left before their meeting. Jimbo stepped aside a little and told the real estate agent that he had a very important meeting and that he probably wouldn't be able to meet with him. Jimbo asked if they could reschedule their meeting for the next day, and this conversation piqued Ju-lin's interest. The real estate agent replied that he could not guarantee that a place would be available the next day, explaining that there were a lot of people interested, and Jimbo was a little confused and didn't know what to do. Ju-lin intervened in the conversation and asked if Jimbo was looking for an apartment since she was talking to a real estate agent. The girl smiled and noted that if the meeting could not take place because of her, then it was not worth taking such a risk. Ju-lin's smile widened and she said they could go see the apartment together and it wouldn't be any trouble at all. Jimbo didn't refuse the offer, and he and Ju-lin went to meet the real estate agent together. Jimbo was told that the apartment was located in a large new residential complex near the metro with a beautifully designed walking area inside. There were no frills in the public amenities nearby, so utility bills were quite reasonable. All the necessary infrastructure was very close by, which was also very convenient. The agent explained that the apartment's layout had a combined balcony, so the living room was simply enormous, and added that the apartment was available and could be moved in immediately. Looking at Jimbo and Ju-lin, the agent added that it was a great option for the newlyweds. Jimbo immediately said very loudly that they were not newlyweds but just friends, and waved his hands to make it seem more credible. Jimbo paced around the apartment saying that this apartment was supposed to be for his sister, who would live there alone, and continued to be indignant that he and his friend were called newlyweds. Jimbo walked up to the window and looked at the view, asking the agent if there was an apartment with a view of the courtyard. The agent explained that there was actually a free apartment upstairs with this view, but it had already been booked. Jimbo asked the agent to contact those who filmed her, and the agent agreed to try, assuming that it might work. Jimbo immediately asked the gentleman to ask if these tenants would agree to terminate their contract if he returned their deposit 3 times as much and also compensated for the moving costs. Ju-lin and the real estate agent immediately froze in place upon hearing what Jimbo was proposing. Ju-lin intervened and said that with such amounts of money, Jimbo could have taken a more spacious place to live and completely abandoned these 2 options. There the girl noted that he could have found a better apartment together and asked why he wanted to buy an apartment here so much. Jimbo looked at Ju-lin and explained that it was his sister's wish and that she wanted to live in this particular residential complex. Then Jimbo again turned to the real estate agent and asked him to tell the potential tenants that if they do not have enough compensation, they can say what they want in return, and he will definitely resolve this issue. Jimbo remembered one of the days when he and his sister were returning home late at night and screaming so loudly that they hit the jackpot while carrying a rice cooker in their hands. Eun-wha was happy that they were given a nearly new vacuum cleaner and rice cooker, simply noting that the rich people from elite houses lived on some other level. Eun-wha looked at her brother and noticed several bandages on his hand and asked what was wrong with his hand and if he was hurt. Jimbo assured her that everything was fine with him and that he had simply overdone it in gym class and now his muscles were sore. He couldn't admit to his sister that he was beaten at school because he didn't want her to worry about him again. He always made up some strange stories so that his sister would believe them, and she had no doubt that they were not true. Then Eun-wha explained to him that he needed to alternate between the cooling and warming patches correctly. She wanted to help him, but he immediately pulled his hand away. I understand that it looks strange that Jimbo apologized to his sister for being a worthless brother and for not even being able to buy her a birthday present. Eun-wha just laughed at this, shifting all the blame onto herself for not giving him enough pocket money, and he in response promised that one day he would become rich and buy her everything she wanted. It was that evening that Eun-wha said that she wanted an apartment in this residential complex and asked her brother to buy it when he became rich. Jimbo, looking where his sister was pointing, immediately realized that he would not be able to make her dream come true, to which Eun-wha laughed, explaining that she was just joking. She explained that their view from the window was simply blocked by a wall, and she wanted them to live in a place where they could see a beautiful garden, and in that case she would no longer have any desires. That same evening, the previous tenant happily accepted the offer with a triple deposit, and Jimbo began completing the paperwork. The courtyard-facing apartment now belonged to his sister. The real estate agent asked Jimbo not to forget to put the stamp next time he came to pay the remaining amount. Jimbo signed his own lease agreement that same day and immediately paid the required money, which greatly impressed Ju-lin. The apartment was in the tallest residential complex in the country, on the 54th floor, measuring 61 square meters, with a view of the Han River and fully finished. No deposit, short-term rental was for 3 months, and Ju-lin heard this and asked him if the rent was too expensive. The girl noted that it was almost a whole year's salary and offered to put down a deposit and reduce the monthly payment. Jimbo gave the girl a tense smile, but he couldn't respond to her. He couldn't explain to her that every time he spent money his life became shorter, and he had no idea how much time he had left. He knew perfectly well that Ju-lin wouldn't believe it anyway. Jimbo held a wallet in his hands, showing him the view from the window, and speaking out loud to his sister, he promised that he would provide her with housing and then leave money in the closet for hospital bills and everyday expenses. Stroking the wallet, which waved its little wings and smiled with joy, Jimbo thought that only by leaving her sister as much money as possible could she die peacefully. He was distracted from these thoughts by the doorbell. Jimbo tensed a little, as he hadn't expected anyone to visit at such an hour. At first he thought it might be food delivery, but he immediately remembered that he hadn't ordered anything at all and could only think that it was the landlord. When he approached the door and looked at the intercom screen, his mouth opened in surprise. Right outside the door stood Ju-lin, who had come without warning at all, and they had not even agreed to meet again. Jimbo couldn't understand what the girl was doing in front of his door, and he even became a little worried because Tak looked upset. Ju-lin stunned Jimbo with her statement that she would like to live with him in the same apartment. Jimbo was shocked by this statement and tried to find out from the girl what was the matter and why she decided to take such a step, but she only laughed. She later explained that she was evicted and lost her entire deposit because she couldn't pay her rent on time and was therefore simply kicked out of her studio. Jimbo remembers all the photos that the girl posted on social networks and was surprised out loud that her family seemed rich. He remembered all her trips abroad and vacations in expensive hotels that she talked about on her Instagram page. He looked at her with confusion and emphasized that she had not even thought about how much she spent on her food and now had difficulties with renting an apartment. Ju-lin smiled broadly and explained that she did not go to restaurants at her own expense and that everything was paid for by her sponsors. She explained that even if she didn't have as many followers as major influencers, but she had her own audience and looked good, others could offer expensive sponsorship deals. However, sponsors were not equal to a stable income and money did not flow directly to her, which means that in essence it was just a show without any real meaning. Ju-lin lightly hugged Jimbo and promised that she would move out from his place as soon as she saved up for the deposit and began asking him to live with her until then. Jimbo felt a multitude of emotions at once. On the one hand, he was thrilled that a girl like Ju-lin had approached him with such a request. He was glad that he had the opportunity to live with the princess, but on the other hand, he was surprised to hear that, in fact, her entire luxurious life was a deception. Jimbo couldn't believe this was actually happening to him. He immediately remembered all the plots of the manga he'd read. Often these mangas started with the life of a simple guy and a gorgeous girl and were simply a classic plot. But Jimbo always had great doubts that this really happens in real life. But now it seemed that dreams were really starting to come true and Jimbo really liked it. Ju-lin got up from the sofa and came close to the confused Jimbo and looked him straight in the eyes, causing a wave of excitement to run through his body again. He looked back at the girl and asked where all her things were and why she didn't take anything with her at all since she decided to live with him. In response, Ju-lin said what she had already said, that she had been evicted while she was not home and she was no longer able to pick up her things. There was a notice on the door that she was being evicted immediately for long-term non-payment of rent, and in addition, the owner of the apartment had changed the password to the door. The girl became embarrassed and explained that she hadn't even changed her clothes, she urgently needed to go somewhere, and there was no time to sort out the situation. She looked at Jimbo again and asked with a smile if he would give her some of his clothes to change into for home. Jimbo gave her one of his t-shirts, and when the girl changed, the t-shirt fit her like a dress. Jimbo couldn't take his eyes off Ju-lin. He found her incredibly sweet and her heart beat faster and then skipped a beat. Jimbo abruptly turned away from Ju-lin, thinking that now even his beloved Miku, who was depicted on the t-shirt, did not attract his attention, and was surprised that 2D really could not surpass 3D. At that very moment, Ju-lin called him again, and he turned around all flushed. Ju-lin, without taking the smile off her face, asked if he was hungry and offered to cook dinner for the two of them. Jimbo couldn't deny that he was hungry and agreed to let Ju-lin cook something, and the girl immediately began to organize dinner. Jimbo walked around her every now and then watching the whole process, but most of all he wanted to watch her herself. He couldn't believe that Ju-lin herself was cooking him dinner in his own kitchen, standing in just an oversized t-shirt in a house where there were only the two of them. For a moment he thought about how it looked like they were actually living the life of newlyweds. These fantasies haunted him. He was so happy that he literally forgot about everything else in the world. Soon Ju-lin announced that their dinner was ready and invited Jimbo to sit at the table, which made him very happy. Ju-lin hoped that Jimbo would like Roman, explaining that there was almost nothing in the refrigerator to cook something else, to which Jimbo apologized, explaining that he usually lived only on deliveries. He looked at the dish that Ju-lin had prepared and was surprised that she called it ramen because even the noodles were drowned in this soup. Jimbo remembered that very ramen from the Han River granny that he usually ate, but these thoughts were interrupted by Ju-lin's apologies for probably overdoing it with water. She looked down and admitted that she didn't know how to properly pour water for ramen, and noted that she would probably soon start to be afraid of the sea at the sight of such soup. Jimbo was surprised that the girl blamed herself and immediately tried to assure her that too much salt was unhealthy, and her dish was an excellent late-night snack. Jimbo immediately started eating, showing that he really liked everything, and promised the girl that he would definitely eat everything. A slight smile immediately appeared on Ju-lin's face. It was clear she was pleased by Jimbo's gesture, and she no longer worried so much about her poor ramen preparation. For a second, Jimbo thought that one day the day would come when his time would come and he would be able to look back. He imagined that he would remember this very moment and already understood that it was worth living for this, and was glad that in one moment everything turned out exactly this way. After dinner, Jimbo hurried to check his wallet, which had been lying in the closet on a small pillow all this time. Jimbo was worried that the wallet was a little stuffy and uncomfortable in the closet, and opening the door slightly asked if it was more comfortable for him, to which he smiled. Having slightly closed the door, Jimbo concluded out loud that the animal after all loved a dark shelter where it could hide from all prying eyes. He immediately thought of Princess Ju-lin and wondered if she had already fallen asleep. Jimbo went out into the hall where he discovered that his girlfriend was watching a TV series on TV. Ju-lin, without taking her eyes off the screen, was glad that Jimbo also knew this series and noted that she wanted to watch it again. Jimbo said that True Attack believed that liking Attack on Titan was a sign of ostentatious, insincere fanaticism, but he personally thought that this was simply a mistake by those who did not bother to understand the meaning and plot of this work. Ju-lin laughed loudly, noting that Jimbo was too serious at that moment. She smiled at him again and suggested that they watch the series together if he still couldn't sleep. When Jimbo joined her, she asked when he started watching Attack on Titan, and Jimbo clarified whether she meant the first time he watched it or the last time he rewatched it. This was another moment when Jimbo felt incredibly happy to be with a beautiful girl and watch his favorite series with her. While watching, they even had time to discuss a little what was happening on the screen, which added a special warmth to this moment. Jimbo cried out joyfully that the scene where Captain Levi first uttered his legendary phrase had finally appeared, and it was a legendary moment that was always included in the top 3 best scenes of Attack on Titan, and at that very moment he noticed that Ju-lin had already fallen asleep on his shoulder. Feeling how the girl had relaxed greatly, Jimbo froze in a position, pointing his hand at the screen. He was afraid to move so as not to wake up Ju-lin and interrupt such a romantic moment. He very quietly and carefully called Ju-lin by name and called her princess, but the girl did not respond. Jimbo smiled and looked at her, noting out loud that apparently everything had gone too far. I looked at her carefully and made sure that the girl had really fallen asleep and was definitely not pretending. Jimbo was confused and didn't know what to do, so he continued to sit with his hand raised up. Morning soon arrived. Jimbo somehow managed to resolve the issue of his girlfriend falling asleep and calm down a bit. Ju-lin was awakened by the sun's rays, which brazenly penetrated the window and shone on her face. Ju-lin also heard some rustling in the apartment and decided that it was time to wake up. The first thing she saw was Jimbo, who was dressed and apparently about to leave somewhere. Jimbo wished the girl good morning in return, and she stretched and asked if he had slept well. Jimbo lied that he had slept well, although in fact he had not closed his eyes all night. Ju-lin was satisfied with his answers, and she immediately asked where he was going to go. Jimbo explained that he needed to pay for his sister's apartment, and Ju-lin immediately remembered that he had warned her about this. Jimbo promised that they would see each other a little later and was about to leave the apartment, but Ju-lin asked him to wait a little. She asked if she could use his computer while he was out. Jimbo said that he didn't mind, but only explained that instead of a computer he had a laptop that was in the room. After that, Ju-lin led Jimbo to the exit and waved her hand, after which he finally went about his business. As soon as the front doors closed, Ju-lin breathed a sigh of relief, but stood in the hallway for a while to make sure that Jimbo had definitely left. Jimbo can't even imagine what awaits him upon returning home and what the one he liked so much was capable of. Towards the evening, a very heavy downpour began and Jimbo returned home completely soaked to the skin. From the threshold, he took off his wet shoes, from which water was literally pouring out through his bag and documents on the floor, and went into the apartment. Well, right there he discovered that Ju-lin was no longer in his apartment, and he ran excitedly to check his valuables. Unfortunately for him, all the money in the closet along with his wallet disappeared along with his girlfriend. Jimbo shouted loudly, worrying about what would happen to his wallet and in general his future, which depended so much on money. A few hours ago, Jimbo put all the necessary stamps and signatures on the documents to transfer the apartment to his sister. The real estate agents explained to him that everything with the paperwork was completed, and now Jimbo only had to transfer the remaining amount for the apartment. Jimbo was very happy because as soon as he transferred the required amount, he and his sister would finally have their own home, and even in the worst-case scenario, life would be much easier than before. Since their parents died, they and their sister spent their entire lives wandering around rented one-room apartments and huddled in cramped conditions, constantly getting in each other's way. When they moved into their current two-room apartment a few years ago, they finally had some personal space, although they even argued a little, but only because each wanted a better room. Jimbo remembers how they then gave each other a room with large windows and ended up having a big fight about it. Now they had their own three-room apartment and two separate toilets, and in the long run they would never quarrel over such a thing again. Jimbo believed that this area should be enough for his sister to have a family life and even have children. By transferring money to the bank account, Jimbo hoped that when he was gone his sister would be happy in this apartment no matter what. Having transferred the money, he notified the real estate agent about this, and they confirmed the transfer of the required amount. One of the agents explained that their lawyer would handle the paperwork and that all documents would be kept by him for some time. At that very moment, Jimbo received a call from Myri University Children's Hospital. The call left him deeply worried about his sister. Immediately after the deal, he rushed to the hospital to find out if everything was okay with his sister. He also brought with him a real estate purchase and sale agreement so that he could immediately provide it to his sister if anything happened. Jimbo received a call from the hospital because his sister's condition had worsened. She was now unconscious with numerous tubes keeping her alive. The doctor led Jimbo into his sister's room, and when he saw her, he simply froze in place and didn't even know what to say. Jimbo went to the doctor and said his sister had been fine just the day before. He couldn't understand how she could have gotten so much worse overnight. The doctor noted with regret that Jimbo should have already seen the blood test results in the app which had been ready that morning. The results showed the patient's neutrophil levels had dropped significantly. Jimbo repeated what the doctor had said again, just trying to understand what was happening and make sure he hadn't mixed anything up. The doctor added that Eunhwa also developed a fever, and that's why they wanted to administer an additional drug that wasn't covered by insurance, so they called Jimbo and the hospital because they needed his consent. Jimbo was deeply concerned about his sister's health. Her life was literally hanging by a thread, even though treatment was generally showing good results. At that very moment, Jimbo remembered the words of the money god, who warned that something very valuable would be taken from him along with the money from his wallet. Then Jimbo, why were you sure that it was about his own health, so you decided to make such a sacrifice for the sake of your sister's happy future? But now he seemed to understand that the money god was not talking about his own health at all, and that Jimbo had simply paid for all the money spent with his sister's life. Jimbo didn't want to believe in such a theory at all, but what was happening didn't allow him to doubt it at all. Jimbo realized that something connected with him was his only blood relative whom he doted on. At that moment, Jimbo realized what a terrible mistake he had made. He simply understood everything incorrectly. Jimbo remembered every time he withdrew money, and it turned out that he simply devoured his own sister's life. Jimbo burst into tears over his sister's hospital bed. He was in despair and didn't know how to fix what had happened. Immediately leaving the hospital right in the rain, Jimbo ran to his home. Jimbo convinced himself that everything was fine, and it was not too late to change the situation and save his sister for real. Jimbo thought that if he returned all the money spent to the wallet, then everything could be fixed and his sister would get better again. He believed in this idea very strongly and ran with all his might, trying to get to his home as quickly as possible. Well, unfortunately, when he got home, other very sad news awaited him. Before this, he couldn't even imagine that Ju-lin would treat him like this and only add to his problems. The girl did not leave a single bill in the closet and took everything clean along with a small pink wallet that was empty in the eyes of others. Jimbo stood in front of the open closet, even more confused. He didn't know where he could find the girl and didn't know how to fix everything now. Until the very end, Jimbo did not want to believe that Ju-lin, whom he considered ideal, was actually capable of stealing money from him. Jimbo stood up and replayed everything that had happened to him recently and tried to remember everything that the money god had told him. The money block mentioned that there were 3 instances where Jimbo would no longer be able to take money from the wallet. The money god warned that when something connected to Jimbo diminishes and eventually disappears completely, access to money will also cease. Jimbo immediately thought that his sister's life had been shortened to its limit, and perhaps this was a sign. This could explain why the wallet and money disappeared and thus justify Ju-lin, who in fact did not steal anything. Jimbo burst into tears again. He trembled with fear and despair, screaming and cursing at everyone around him. Jimbo picked up the pillow on which the wallet had been lying and, clutching it tightly, continued to scream, imagining that his sister was about to die. He was in complete despair and did not want to allow the worst thing in his life to happen, and besides, he felt enormous guilt for what he had done. Jimbo fell to his knees and hugged the pillow tightly to himself, begging the money god to cancel their contract, assuring him that he no longer needed money and that he was ready to become a beggar again. He asked for the money to be returned to the wallet and for everything to return to the way it was before. But suddenly Jimbo heard some kind of squeak and immediately calmed down and stopped crying. On the leg of the chair under its seat, Jimbo found a wallet that had a very dissatisfied look. Jimbo was very happy because this meant that his sister was still alive and there was a chance to fix everything. Jimbo crawled up to the wallet and wanted to pick it up, but it quickly flapped its wings and continued squeaking. Jimbo came closer and saw that the wallet was covered with some kind of fur and apparently evolved again. It was joyful that the little creature was developing, but Jimbo took him in his arms and said that now they had very little time since his sister was feeling bad. Jimbo immediately began to stuff the bundles of money back into the wallet, which happily swallowed them. Jimbo was glad that the wallet finally agreed to eat his money back and continued to stuff pack after pack. Jimbo was very glad that the money he withdrew for his sister to leave in her apartment was still with him. After thinking for a bit and looking around, Jimbo realized that the money that was in his closet was stolen by Ju-lin. Well, overall it was a small problem, because if the wallet had been used up, at least the ones that Jimbo had left as an inheritance for his sister, then her condition should have improved. Jimbo continued to feed the wallet his own money in the hope that it would be able to restore his sister's health, but at some point the wallet became very fat and refused to accept any more money. The wallet looked like a big well-fed hamster and seemed to be feeling rather unwell after swallowing so many wads of money. And at that very moment the wallet opened and all the money it had swallowed flew out and scattered all over the room. Jimbo started crying again as he watched the money fly back out at high speed. He bent over the wallet and began to beg him not to spit the money back out since he no longer needed it. He begged the wallet to save his sister, and at some point the magical creature froze with a single bill in its mouth. The wallet seemed to hear Jimbo's pleas, and having spat out the last bill did not do it again. Soon Jimbo went to the hospital again, and was very surprised by what the doctors told him. Unhwa's neutrophil levels had stabilized again, meaning that the next round of chemotherapy could be carried out as scheduled. Jimbo began to thank the doctor for the work he had done, and admitted that he had already thought that his sister was dying. Jimbo began to cry again, and admitted that he was very worried that his sister was dying because of him. The doctor, watching Jimbo's crushed state, asked him to listen to something and noted that chemotherapy could be compared to running. The doctor explained that if you compare them, chemotherapy was not a sprint but a marathon, and during treatment the neutrophil level would drop more than once, and warned that if Jimbo was worried like this every time, he simply wouldn't be able to cope mentally. The doctor looked at Jimbo with a serious expression and assured her that his sister was holding up well, and that it was simply worth being a support for her. These words were very important for Jimbo to hear. A smile immediately lit up his face and the tears quickly began to dry. When the wallet spat out the money, Jimbo was in complete despair and watched in horror at all the cancer patients he met in the hospital and compared them to his sister. Jimbo felt like he had killed his sister with his own hands, and that was why he wanted to die himself. Jimbo was very glad that what was decreasing due to the money spent had nothing to do with the life of his own older sister. But Jimbo now had to find out what the price for the large amount of money spent was really, because he felt great even while climbing up the stairs many floors. It remained a mystery to him, and he really wanted to know in advance what he was actually sacrificing. Having climbed the stairs and found himself near the doors, he tried to push all these thoughts aside and concentrate on the current tasks. He tried to convince himself that it made no difference what he was actually paying with unless it was definitely his sister's health. He clung to the thought that in the end he had done everything only for her sake, and he needed to continue thinking only about how to save her from a terrible disease. He was finally allowed to visit his sister, and he carefully entered the room and saw Unhwa standing within 4 drip near the window. Unhwa heard the doors to her room open and immediately turned around at the sound. She was very happy to see her older brother and smiled widely at him. After examining her brother from head to toe, Unhwa asked why he was sweating so much and noted that he looked completely exhausted. Jimbo looked at his sister, who was the first to worry about him, and once again swore to himself that he would do everything possible to help her recover. Jimbo looked at her and asked if she had any dreams or wishes and promised that he would do absolutely everything for her. He was seriously determined to fulfill her every whim and every desire, no matter what she wanted. Well, besides his sister's wishes, Jimbo had one more issue to resolve, and he spent a very long time at the computer with his wallet. Jimbo needed to deal with one problem that was the most important at that time after his sister. Jimbo had to find Ju-lin, who had treated him so meanly and robbed him, and at least get her money back. When Jimbo addressed his sister, she was initially a little wary because her brother's tone was serious. She didn't expect that Jimbo would ask her to name her most cherished dreams and wishes, and moreover promise to fulfill them exactly. Unhwa didn't answer him right away. She was slightly confused, then thought about what she really wanted. Well, after thinking for a bit, Unhwa smiled at her brother and replied that she still had one wish and she would really like to make it come true. A little later, Jimbo and his sister went out into the yard to take a short walk and get some fresh air while the girl was feeling well, and there she told him about her work injury. Unhwa thought that her illness was a work injury, although Jimbo could not understand why she had such thoughts. She told how a few days ago she had spoken with her colleagues who came to visit her and mentioned something in her presence. They had a very nice time, and as they were saying goodbye, they wished her a speedy recovery and promised that as soon as she was discharged from the hospital, they would definitely meet. After this, the girl closed the doors behind them and went to her bed filled with many emotions. Right in front of her, her colleagues were talking about Ms. Ji-hai, who worked in the neighboring department and also fell ill with leukemia a year ago and quit because of it. Eun-hwa immediately thought that this was just a coincidence and that it was worth analyzing the current situation in more detail. Very soon, she met her boss in the corridor, which actually surprised her a lot since they had not arranged to meet. The man looked quite worried. His face was literally gone. But the boss had come to see her specifically. The boss came to explain that according to internal regulations, the company could not provide the girl with indefinite sick leave as an exception. He said that in addition, in order to cover the gap caused by her absence, other employees had to bear, so to speak, a double burden. The boss didn't beat around the bush and immediately stated that Eun-hwa should focus on her treatment while the company would formalize her dismissal to reduce the burden on her colleagues. Her boss gave her a resignation letter. All she had to do was fill it out and sign it. It was immediately clear the company had already made its decision. The boss promised her that he would personally ensure that her severance pay and the remainder of her salary were paid as soon as possible, and that was all he could offer her. Eun-hwa closed the document, barely holding back her tears, and asked her boss if signing these papers could wait. She immediately explained that she would like to think a little before signing all these documents, but her boss was not thrilled with the idea. However, the boss still agreed and asked the girl not to rush but to call the next day and he would come again for the application. Then Eun-hwa explained that it was not that, and she was just afraid that she would need more time, and then shared her thoughts that perhaps her illness was an industrial injury. The boss immediately became furious and slammed his palm on the table, outraged by his employee's assumption. The man looked at the girl with some disappointment and after saying her full name fell silent for a moment, choosing the right words. The man approached the window and noted that when a person faced a serious illness, his spirit weakened, and he reproached himself, asking himself why it all happened and trying to find a reason or someone to blame outside. The man noted that he understood all of this but still considered it selfish to harm the company and his colleagues because of such experiences. The man emphasized that they tried to understand the girl's situation, and now, after such words, he felt discouraged. He slammed his fist on the table again and warned the girl that once her sick leave ended, any further absence would be considered an enemy and would ultimately lead to disciplinary action and dismissal, and asked if she was prepared for this. Before leaving, the man said that he really hoped for her discretion, hinting that she had no other option but to sign a resignation letter. Eun-hwa also told her brother that since then, they'd been calling her every day asking if she'd sign the statement. She knew it was all strange and didn't know what to do. She understood that roughly speaking it would have been easy for them to fire her for absenteeism, but they acted as if they desperately needed her signature. Jimbo looked at his sister and remembered what the doctor told him, that it was impossible to determine the exact cause of leukemia, to which his sister agreed. She emphasized that it was for this reason that while she was alive, she wanted to try to prove that her illness was indeed an industrial injury. The girl looked up at the sky as a plane flew directly overhead. She paused for a moment, lost in thought, and then they continued their walk. After walking a little more, Eun-hwa and Jimbo sat down on a bench, and then the girl reminded him that she had opened a savings account in her brother's name. She said that there were several million won in this account and asked if she could use this money to have her illness recognized as an industrial injury. She never expected that Jimbo would refuse such an offer in a rather rude manner. Jimbo said that since his sister saved this money for him, then in that case he would take it. Eun-hwa laughed and replied that in that case she couldn't do anything, although some part of her tensed up after receiving a refusal. Jimbo immediately explained that he would prove that it was an industrial injury and would pay for everything with his own money. Every day he understood much more where he had previously been unable to find a connection. In his life, he read a lot of comics where the heroes could become superheroes. Each hero always received their own superpower, which came with ever-increasing responsibility. Along with this superpower and responsibility, superheroes acquired a mission for which they were willing to risk their own lives, and this mission became the purpose of their lives. Looking at his wallet, Jimbo understood why he had such a special ability. Now he understood that this was not only his sister's wish, but also an item from his personal wish list. That same evening, Jimbo came home and immediately began to gradually realize his and his sister's shared desire. He put the wallet on the table and invited him to change the world together, and the little creature flapped its wings with joy. Jimbo decided he needed to find a workplace injury lawyer and perhaps even a law firm first. He decided he needed to attend at least one consultation first, and then he'd have a clearer idea of where to start. He visited one of the websites, deciding to start with it. His data was saved and he simply clicked a button to log into his account. But when the page refreshed, Jimbo's face showed strong surprise. It turned out that he logged in under the account of Ju-lin, who had after all used his computer on the day she disappeared with his money. He got a little angry with the girl because she was careless and used someone else's computer without unchecking the auto-login box, and decided that first he needed to log out of her account. But suddenly his gaze stopped on one of the dialogues, which greatly attracted his attention. The girl received a message from a certain Ji Ha-gun, who wrote to her that he had obtained 500 million in cash and was going to come to her and bring this money. Jimbo wondered what this could mean because the amount discussed in the dialogue was very large. Curiosity got the better of him, and Jimbo decided to open the dialogue and read the correspondence to find out what they were actually talking about. But unfortunately, he was unable to do this as the chat was immediately deleted. Then the page refreshed and Jimbo was forcibly kicked out of Ju-lin's account. Jimbo realized that the girl probably saw the login notification from the computer and deleted the correspondence and logged out of the account. He caught himself thinking that he had completely forgotten about this situation with Ju-lin because of his sister's problems. But this girl was still a thief who took from him those same 500 million that were probably discussed in the correspondence. Jimbo now had to do a lot to resolve the situation and get his money back and teach the thief a lesson. He promised himself that he would definitely do everything possible to restore justice and show the girl that she had done very wrong. Meanwhile, Il-suk and Ah-jun sat together and drank heavily while talking about Jong Jimbo. Il-suk did not want to leave this situation just like that, and convinced his friend that she should not have ignored Jimbo's money, who moreover treated them rudely. And Jean was very angry. I don't understand what his friend could offer him in this case except to go and get punched in the face again to beat compensation out of him. And Jean reminded that Il-suk was also hit and he should have understood what was happening, and on top of that he called him an idiot. And Jean convinced his friend that Jimbo could go berserk at any moment and was dangerous. The guy was sure that this fat guy would grind them into powder with even more revenge near his forehead. And Jean looked at his friend and decided that he himself should have felt this overwhelming difference in their strength. The boys looked at each other and then looked down and remained sitting in silence thinking about it. For them, such changes in the former loser were a real shock, and they no longer felt so confident. It could be compared to a horror once experienced that was not so easily forgotten. At that moment, Il-suk's phone vibrated, notifying him of a new message. Il-suk picked up his phone and opened the message, immediately telling his friend who they were talking about, which he wrote himself. And Jean was very surprised by this, not expecting that they would have to meet again so quickly. And Jean asked his friend what Jong Jimbo wanted from him, and then replied that they were invited to visit. And Jean got really furious when he heard this, thinking that the fat guy had gotten a big head out of himself just by hitting them once, and thinking that now they would be at his beck and call. Il-suk didn't react to this message that way. Rather, he was more interested in it since Jimbo had promised to give them your money. The guys, without hesitation, immediately went to Jimbo's home and were very surprised when they saw his new apartment. Il-suk emphasized that the rent for this apartment cost at least 20 million a month, while another believed that only an idol would live in such an apartment. Jimbo asked the guys to stop looking around and suggested that they get down to business, which is why they actually came to his house. The guys were outraged that this fat guy started acting tough as soon as he had money, but they didn't say it out loud. Jimbo told the boys and the kids about what happened to Ju-lin. They laughed so loudly that they even woke up the wallet, which was sleeping peacefully on the pillow in the closet. The guys were really amused by the fact that such a cool Jimbo was robbed by a girl. Il-suk started laughing at him, saying that he hadn't changed a bit except that girls were now robbing him, but Jean asked him to keep his mouth shut. Jimbo became angry at such ridicule and immediately clenched his fists tightly, showing that he could hit because of such words. Il-suk, seeing this, immediately began to ask him to lower his fists and began to apologize, explaining that they were actually very worried about him. And Jean understood that his friend was talking nonsense, shut his mouth firmly, and clarified with Jimbo that it turned out that they were required to go and return the money that this woman had stolen. Jimbo confirmed this and promised to give them 20% of the amount found. Imagine how much money they could get from this, and June was even happy and promised that they would do everything because they were professionals in this matter, because even if I didn't find at least 10 million, 2 of them would be theirs. Il-suk joined his friend, noting that that's what friends were for, to help each other in difficult times. Jimbo grimaced when he heard the boys mention friendship and noted that, in his opinion, Omitari and Watashi were not in such a relationship. The guys tried to smooth out the tension as much as possible and decided to ask how much money had to be returned. Jimbo answered directly that he needed to return 500 million. When the boys heard the amount, they froze in place, their eyes wide. They had no idea it would be so large. But this was even to their advantage because in this case their profit was also quite large, and Jun hitting the table with her fist noted that Jimbo was not their friend. And Jean shouted that Jimbo was their boss and literally knelt down in front of him with his head bowed. Immediately after this, Jun asked about the coordinates and confirmed that he and Il-suk would immediately go look for the money. Il-suk also joined his friend and knelt down in front of Jimbo, showing that he was also interested in this matter and would do everything perfectly. Jimbo was very happy with how the situation was developing and that the guys agreed to take part in this matter.